Blake Morrison stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment, gazing out at the San Francisco skyline. The morning fog rolled over the Golden Gate Bridge, obscuring its iconic red towers. In his hand, a crystal tumbler of single. Malt whiskey caught the early light, amber liquid swirling as he contemplated the emptiness that had become his constant companion. At 42, Blake had everything money could buy. As CEO of Morrison Enterprises, a tech empire he'd built from scratch, his net worth exceeded 8 figures. The penthouse, the vacation homes in Aspen and the Hamptons, the collection of vintage sports cars, all testament to his success. Yet each morning he woke with the same hollowness in his chest, a void no acquisition could fill. His phone buzzed. Harrison Ward, his COO and oldest friend, was calling about the quarterly board meeting. Blake ignored it. The company could run itself for a day. Instead, he moved to his walk-in closet, selecting a tailored charcoal suit, crisp white shirt and Italian leather shoes. His reflection in the mirror showed a handsome face hardened by ambition, steel blue eyes that rarely softened, dark, hair graying at the temples, jawline set in perpetual determination. Women found him attractive, men found him intimidating. Blake found himself increasingly unrecognizable. 3 hours later, he sat in a sterile conference room, half listening as Harrison presented projections for the coming quarter. Around the gleaming mahogany table, board members nodded approvingly. At charts showing upward trends, Blake's mind wandered, his gaze drifting to the window where rain now pelted the glass. "Blake, your thoughts?" Harrison's voice cut through his haze. "Proceed as outlined," Blake replied automatically, having mastered the art of appearing engaged when his mind was elsewhere. That evening, Blake attended a charity gala at the Fairmont Hotel, another night of meaningless small talk with people who wanted something from him. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands, smiling without warmth, nursing a scotch that never seemed to empty. Women in designer gowns cast appreciative glances his way. Business associates clapped his shoulder with forced camaraderie. None of it touched him. "Mr. Morrison, your generosity tonight will change lives," gushed the gala organizer, a middle-aged woman in a sequined dress. Blake had donated $50,000, an amount that meant nothing to him, but would look good in the society pages. "Happy to help," he replied, with the mechanical smile he'd perfected years ago. By 11, Blake had reached his threshold for superficial interaction. He slipped away from the ballroom, heading toward the hotel's side exit to avoid the paparazzi camped at the main entrance. As he pushed through the service corridor, he nearly collided with a man pushing a cleaning cart. "Sorry, sir," the man said, quickly maneuvering the cart aside. Blake barely glanced at him, but something made him pause. The maintenance worker was probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of manual labor. Yet there was a dignity in his posture, a clarity in his eyes that caught Blake off guard. "No problem," Blake muttered, reaching for Aoi. The door. "Nasty night to be heading out," the man observed, nodding toward the exit where rain hammered against the glass. "Storm's getting worse." Blake paused, hand on the door. People in service positions rarely initiated conversation with him. "I'll survive." The man smiled, not the obsequious smile of someone hoping for a tip, but something genuine. "I'm sure you will. You look like someone who's weathered plenty of storms." There was something in his tone, not pity exactly, but a sort of recognition that made Blake uncomfortable. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just an observation," the man shrugged, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl. "Been working in hotels for 30 years. You get to recognize the look." "What look?" Blake challenged, irritated yet inexplicably drawn into the conversation. "The look of someone who's got everything and nothing all at once." The man's eyes, a deep brown that seemed to hold decades of quiet wisdom, met Blake's with unexpected directness. For a moment, Blake felt transparent, as if this stranger in a hotel uniform had peered directly into the emptiness he worked, so hard to conceal. The sensation was so disconcerting that he pushed through the door without responding, stepping into the rain without his waiting umbrella. The storm had intensified, sheets of water cascading from a black sky. Blake stood frozen, rain soaking through his expensive suit, plastering his hair to his forehead. He could call his driver, but something kept him rooted to the spot, the maintenance worker's words echoing in his mind. A sudden gust of wind tore, an awning loose from the building across the street. Blake watched as it cartwheeled down the sidewalk, heading directly toward an unsuspecting woman, hurrying along with her head down. Without thinking, he lunged forward, shouting a warning that was swallowed by the wind. The woman looked up just as Blake reached her, his hand closing around her arm and pulling her back, as the metal frame of the awning crashed onto the sidewalk where she'd been standing seconds before. "Oh my God!" she gasped, clutching Blake's arm for support. You saved me." Blake stared at the twisted metal on the sidewalk, adrenaline surging through his veins. For the first time in years, he felt fully present in his body, aware of his heart pounding against his ribs, the rain cold against his skin. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I think so," she nodded, rain streaming down her face. "Thank you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't—" A sudden clap of thunder cut her off, followed by a flash of lightning that illuminated her face. Blake felt a jolt of recognition, though he was certain they'd never met. There was something in her features, perhaps the shape of her eyes or the curve of her jawline, that stirred a distant memory he couldn't quite grasp. "Do I know you?" he asked, frowning. She looked at him more closely, water dripping from her lashes. "I don't think so. I'm Lily Reeves." Blake Morrison. He waited for the usual flicker of recognition his name typically evoked, but her expression remained unchanged. "Well, Blake Morrison," she said with a small smile, "I guess I owe you my life." As they stood in the downpour, a strange feeling washed over Blake. Not quite déjà vu, but something equally unsettling. As if in saving this stranger he had somehow altered the course of his own carefully controlled existence. What neither of them noticed was the hotel maintenance worker, watching from the doorway, a knowing smile playing on his lips as the rain continued to fall. 3 days had passed since the storm, yet Blake couldn't shake the memory of the woman he'd saved. Lily Reeves. The name played like a loop in his mind, disrupting his carefully ordered thoughts. He sat in his office, the quarterly reports forgotten on his desk as he stared unseeing at the panoramic view of San Francisco Bay. "You've been distracted all week," Harrison observed, leaning against the doorframe. "The Peterson merger isn't going to negotiate itself." Blake swiveled his chair facing his oldest friend. Harrison had been with him since the beginning, when Morrison Enterprises was nothing more than an ambitious business plan drafted in a rented garage. Unlike Blake, who'd grown increasingly detached, Harrison had maintained his humanity. He had a wife of 15 years, twin daughters in high school, a golden retriever named Oscar. "I met someone," Blake said, surprising himself with the admission. Harrison's eyebrows shot up. "A woman? That's your big distraction. You meet beautiful women every week." "This is different." Blake struggled to articulate what made Lily Reeves different from the parade of socialites and models who'd briefly entered his life. There was something familiar about her. Familiar how? Blake shook his head. "I don't know. Like I've seen her before, but I can't place where." Harrison smirked. "Maybe in another life? Didn't take you for the reincarnation type, Blake." "Very funny." Blake reached for his jacket. "I need some air. Reschedule the Peterson call." Outside, the mid-September air was crisp, hints of autumn coloring the edges of summer's warmth. Blake walked without destination, letting his feet carry him away from the financial district's gleaming towers. Somehow he found himself at Portsmouth Square, where elderly Chinese men played chess and tourists snapped photos of Chinatown's ornate gate. He sat on a bench, watching people move through their daily lives with a sense of purpose that had long eluded him. A street performer played the erhu, the two-stringed instrument's mournful sound weaving through the ambient noise of the city. "Quite beautiful, isn't it?" Blake turned to find the hotel maintenance worker sitting beside him. The man was dressed in worn jeans and a faded flannel shirt, a far cry from the uniform he'd worn at the Fairmont. Up close, Blake noticed the deep lines etching his face, like a map of years lived fully. "Are you following me?" Blake demanded, unnerved by the coincidence. The man chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. Life has its own way of arranging meetings. I'm Ray Jenkins. Reluctantly, Blake shook the offered hand, feeling calluses against his palm. Blake Morrison. I know who you are, Ray said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Your face. Here's on the cover of half the business magazines in the checkout line. Blake shifted uncomfortably. What do you want? Nothing at all, Ray replied easily. Just enjoying the music and the sunshine, same as you. They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the erhu's haunting melody. You said something the other night, Blake finally said, about having everything and nothing at once. Ray nodded slowly. Did that strike a chord? Why would you say that to a complete stranger? Sometimes strangers see us more clearly than those who think they know us. Ray reached into his pocket, retrieving a small, worn photograph. Here's something that might interest you. Blake accepted the photo with reluctance. It showed a young woman in her 20s, standing on what appeared to be a ferry, the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the background. She wore a yellow sundress, her hair lifting in the breeze, her smile radiant. Something about her face made Blake's heart skip a beat. Who is this? He asked, unable to tear his eyes from the image. Someone I used to know long time ago, Ray said vaguely. Reminds me of that woman you helped during the storm. Blake's head snapped up. How did you... I saw it happen, Ray shrugged. From the hotel doorway. Blake looked back at the photograph, a strange uneasiness creeping up his spine. The woman did resemble Lily, or perhaps it was just his imagination, fueled by Ray's suggestion. Keep it, Ray said, standing up. Maybe it'll help you figure out what you're looking for. Before Blake could protest, Ray walked away, merging with the flow of pedestrians until he disappeared from view. Blake sat there, the photograph burning a hole in his palm, questions multiplying in his mind. That evening, instead of returning to his empty penthouse, Blake drove aimlessly through the city. The photograph lay on the passenger seat of his Aston Martin, an insistent presence he couldn't ignore. Eventually, he found himself in the Mission District, where Technicolor murals decorated building sides and the scent of street food permeated the air. He parked outside a small bookstore called Turning Pages. The window display featured local authors and handwritten recommendation cards. As he moved to walk past, something caught his eye, a woman arranging books on a display table inside. Lily Reeves. Blake stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching. As she worked, completely absorbed in her task. She wore simple jeans and a blue sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. There was an authenticity about her that seemed so at odds with the carefully curated world he inhabited. Before he could second-guess himself, he pushed open the door, a small bell announcing his entrance. Lily looked up, recognition dawning, slowly on her face. It's you, she said, setting down the book in her hands. The man from the storm. Blake, he reminded her, suddenly feeling out of place in his tailored suit among the crowded bookshelves. I remember, she smiled. What brings you to my humble shop, Blake Morrison? Looking for something to read? Your shop, he asked, glancing around at the cozy space filled with books from floor to ceiling. For the past 5 years, she nodded. Not exactly a fortune. 500 company, but it's mine. There was pride in her voice that resonated with Blake. He remembered that feeling from the early days of his own business, before success had become a hollow pursuit of more. Actually, he said, I was driving by and saw you through the window. I wanted to see how you were doing. After the incident, her expression softened. That's thoughtful of you. I'm fine, thanks to your quick reflexes. She tilted her head, studying him. But something tells me that's not the only reason you're here. Blake hesitated, then reached into his pocket for the photograph. Do you recognize this woman? Lily took the photo, her brow furrowing as she examined it. Should I? She's pretty. The man who gave it to me thought she looked like you. What man? Someone I barely know. He works at the Fairmont, maintenance staff. Lily handed the photo back, shaking her head. Sorry, I don't see the resemblance. And I don't know anyone who works at the Fairmont. Blake slipped the photo back into his pocket, feeling foolish. For of course it was a long shot. An awkward silence fell between them. Blake, normally confident in any situation, found himself at a loss for words. "Would you like some tea?" Lily asked suddenly. "I was just about to close up shop and have a cup." The offer surprised him. "You're closing, it's only 7. One of the luxuries of being your own boss," she smiled. "You get to set your own hours." Blake thought of his own rigidly scheduled life, the endless meetings and obligations that filled his calendar months in advance. "Tea sounds nice," he said. Lily flipped the open sign to closed and led him to a small back room lined with more bookshelves. A kettle sat on a hot plate beside a sink, and 2 well-worn armchairs faced each other across a low table, stacked with literary journals. "It's not exactly the Ritz," she said, filling the kettle. "It's perfect," Blake replied, surprised to find he meant it. As they settled with steaming mugs, Lily asked about his work. Blake gave her the abbreviated version, the one he used at cocktail parties: tech innovation, market disruption, exponential growth. "Sounds impressive," she said, "and completely rehearsed. Do you ever get tired of that speech?" Her directness caught him off guard. "What makes you think it's rehearsed?" "Your eyes," she said simply. "They don't light up when you talk about your company." But I bet they did once. Blake felt that unsettling transparency again, the same sensation he'd experienced with Ray. "And what about you? Do your eyes light up when you talk about selling books?" "Most days," she admitted. "Not because of the sales figures, but because of the stories. Each book is a world someone created, and I get to connect those worlds with the right readers. It's a small magic, but it's real." As she spoke about her passion for literature, about the community events she hosted at the shop, about the local authors she championed, Blake found himself leaning forward, drawn in by her genuine enthusiasm. It had been so long since he'd spoken to someone who wasn't trying to impress him or extract something from him. "What about your family?" he asked, eager to know more about her. "Are they in San Francisco too?" A shadow crossed Lily's face. "I never knew my father. My mother died when I was 19, cancer." "I'm sorry," Blake said, meaning it. "It was a long time ago." She took a sip of tea. "What about your family?" Blake rarely spoke about his past, but something about Lily's honest vulnerability made him want to reciprocate. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 12. I was raised by my grandmother until she passed away during my second year of college." "So we're both orphans," Lily observed softly. "I suppose we are." As night fell outside the bookshop window, they continued talking, moving from personal histories to favorite books, from travel dreams to childhood memories. For the first time in years, Blake lost track of time, forgot to check his phone, allowed himself to simply be present in a conversation that demanded nothing of him except his authentic self. When he finally looked at his watch, it was nearly midnight. "I've kept you far too long," he said, standing reluctantly. "I didn't notice the time either," Lily admitted, walking him to the door. Under the streetlight, Blake turned to her. "Could I see you again?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with possibility. Lily considered him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if looking for something hidden beneath the surface. "Why?" she asked finally. "What is it you're looking for, Blake Morrison?" It was the same question Ray had implied earlier that day, and Blake still didn't have an answer. But standing there in the quiet street, looking at this woman who somehow felt both like a stranger and someone he'd known all his life, he knew he needed to find out. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I think you might help me figure it out." Lily smiled then, a smile that reached her eyes and stirred something long dormant in Blake's chest. "Dinner tomorrow? There's a little Italian place around the corner that makes incredible gnocchi." "I'd like that," Blake said, feeling as if he stood on the edge of an unseen precipice. As he drove home through the sleeping city, the photograph lay forgotten on his passenger seat, the face of the woman in the yellow dress watching him from another time, another life. A connection he had yet to understand, but would soon change everything he thought he knew about himself. The boardroom. fell silent as Blake stopped mid-presentation. For the past week, he had been functioning on autopilot, his mind constantly wandering back to Lily Reeves and the questions that swirled around her. 3 dinner dates, 2 walks along the Embarcadero, countless text messages, and yet the more time he spent with her, the stronger his sense of uncanny familiarity grew. "Blake?" Harrison's voice cut through his reverie. "The Nakamura projections?" "Right." Blake clicked to the next slide, acutely aware of the concerned glances exchanged by his executive team. Blake Morrison never lost focus during meetings. Blake Morrison never checked his phone for text messages from a bookshop owner. Blake Morrison never smiled spontaneously at nothing in particular, but that was exactly what he'd been doing lately, and it was causing ripples through the carefully controlled ecosystem of Morrison Enterprises. After the meeting, Harrison followed, Blake into his office, closing the door behind him. "What's going on with you? And don't say nothing, because we both know that's not true." Blake sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. "I can't explain it, Harrison. There's something about Lily that feels significant. You've known her for what, a week? And suddenly she's more important than the merger we've been working toward for 2 years. It's not that simple," Blake protested, though he knew Harrison had a point. "There's something else going on. The man who gave me that photograph, Ray Jenkins, he keeps appearing in my life. At the hotel in the park outside my building yesterday." Harrison's expression shifted from frustration to concern. "Wait, someone's following you. Have you called security?" "No, it's not like that. He's not threatening. He's just there. And he knows things about me, about Lily. Things he shouldn't know." "Like what?" Blake hesitated. How could he explain the way Ray seemed to see through his carefully constructed facade? The cryptic comments about paths crossing and destinies intertwining. He implied that Lily and I are connected somehow, that we've met before. Harrison sighed, taking the seat across from Blake. "Look, I'm happy you've met someone who makes you smile like a teenager. God knows you needed it. But don't let some cryptic old man with a photograph turn this into something weird. Maybe he's just a harmless eccentric, or maybe he's setting you up for something. Either way, don't lose your head over it." Blake knew his friend meant well, but Harrison couldn't understand. He hadn't felt the electric jolt of recognition when he first saw Lily in the rain. He hadn't experienced the ease of conversation that flowed between them, as if they were resuming a dialogue started long ago rather than beginning a new one. "I need to know who she is," Blake said quietly. "Who she really is, and why she feels so familiar to me." Harrison stood, shaking his head. "Just be careful. You've built something valuable here. Don't throw it away chasing ghosts." After Harrison left, Blake pulled out the photograph Ray had given him, the woman in the yellow dress. He studied it for the 100th time, trying to place her face to understand why it haunted him. On impulse, he turned it over. In faded blue ink, a date was written, June 18th, 1982. More than 40 years ago. Blake called his assistant. "Cancel my appointments for the afternoon. I have something important to take care of." An hour later, he sat in the archives of the San Francisco Chronicle, scrolling through digitized newspapers from June 1982. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, perhaps a mention of the woman in the photograph, a clue to her identity, but page after page revealed nothing significant until, on a whim, he searched for his own surname, Morrison. The headline jumped out at him. Local business owner missing after boating accident. The article detailed how Jonathan Morrison, 35, had failed to return from a solo sailing trip in San Francisco Bay on June 17, 1982. The Coast Guard had found his damaged sailboat, but no sign of Morrison. He was presumed drowned. Blake stared at the screen, his heart pounding. Jonathan Morrison, his father's name. But it couldn't be the same man. His father had died with his mother in a car accident when Blake was 12. That's what his grandmother had always told him. Shaken, he continued searching, finding a follow-up article a week later. A small funeral service had been held for Jonathan Morrison, attended by his business partners and his pregnant wife, Elizabeth Morrison. Pregnant wife. The words seemed to vibrate on the screen. Blake had been an only child. His mother had never been pregnant again after having him. And yet, according to the article, Elizabeth Morrison had been expecting a child when Jonathan Morrison disappeared in June 1982. Blake's birthday was February 14th, 1983, exactly 8 months after Jonathan Morrison's disappearance. With trembling fingers, he searched for Elizabeth Morrison, finding an obituary from October 1983. Elizabeth Morrison, 32, had died of complications following a difficult childbirth. She was survived by her infant daughter, Lily. The room seemed to tilt around him. It couldn't be possible. The Lily he knew couldn't be his sister. His mother had died with his father. He'd never had a sister. His grandmother would have told him, unless she hadn't known. Unless no one had connected Elizabeth Morrison, widowed and alone, with the Jonathan Morrison, who had supposedly died in a car accident with his wife. But why the elaborate lie? Why had his grandmother told him his parents died together? And who was the woman he had always believed was his mother? Blake pushed back from the computer, his mind reeling with questions. He needed to speak with Lily immediately, to compare what she knew of her past with what he'd just discovered. But as he reached for his phone, another thought stopped him cold. What if she didn't know either? What if revealing this information shattered her understanding of her own history as completely as it had just shattered his? He needed more information, more certainty before approaching her with such a life-altering possibility. On his way out of the archive, Blake bumped into a woman carrying a stack of folders, papers scattered across the floor, and as he knelt to help gather them, he noticed the name on one of the files, Jenkins, Raymond. "I'm so sorry about that," the woman said, collecting her documents. "These old case files are heading for digitization." "Case files?" Blake asked, handing her the folder with Ray's name. "Cold cases," she explained. "The Chronicle did a series on unsolved disappearances in the 80s. I'm researching a follow-up piece." Blake's pulse quickened. "May I ask, that file, Jenkins, what was that case about?" The woman hesitated, then shrugged. "Public record anyway. Raymond Jenkins was a detective with SFPD who disappeared in 1984 while investigating a series of suspicious deaths connected to Avalon Investments. His body was never found. Detective Raymond Jenkins. The maintenance worker who kept appearing in Blake's life claimed to be Ray Jenkins, but if the real Raymond Jenkins had disappeared 40 years ago. "Thank you," Blake said, his mind spinning with new questions. "How you've been very helpful." Outside, the October sun was setting over the bay, casting long shadows across the city. Blake drove to his penthouse in a daze, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed beginning to take shape in his mind. If Lily was his sister, if Ray Jenkins was a long-missing detective, if his father hadn't died in a car accident but had disappeared at sea, what did it all mean? How were these threads connected? As he entered his building, the doorman handed him a small package. "This was delivered for you, Mr. Morrison. The messenger said it was urgent." In his apartment, Blake opened the package to find an old leather-bound journal. A note was attached. "Some questions can only be answered by those who lived them. Arja." The journal's pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting that detailed an investigation into Avalon Investments and its founder, Edward Thorne. According to the entries, Detective Jenkins had been looking into several deaths connected to the company. Deaths that had been ruled accidental but which Jenkins believed were murders. One name appeared repeatedly throughout the journal, Jonathan Morrison. According to Jenkins' notes, Morrison had been Thorne's business partner until he discovered evidence of financial crimes. The last entry, dated July 1984, read, "Morrison didn't drown." He was silenced. "Thorne will try to eliminate me next. If anything happens to me, the truth about JM can be found in the Sausalito Marina locker, number 247. Blake sat back, his breath coming in short gasps. Edward Thorne. The name was familiar. Thorne Global was one of the largest investment firms on the West Coast, and its founder, now in his 80s, was a legendary figure in financial circles. Blake had met him several times at charity events, had even considered a partnership with Thorne's grandson, who now ran the company. His phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. It was Lily. "Blake, are you okay? We were supposed to meet for dinner an hour ago." He glanced at his watch, shocked to realize how much time had passed. "Lily, I'm sorry, something came up, something important." "You sound strange," she said, concern evident in her voice. "What's going on?" Blake hesitated. He couldn't tell her what he'd discovered, not yet, not over the phone. "Can you meet me tomorrow? There's something I need to talk to you about." "You're scaring me a little," she admitted. "Is everything all right?" "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I think we need to talk about our parents." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Our parents? What do you mean?" "Just where did you grow up? Who raised you after your mother died?" Another pause. "I was adopted by a couple in Oregon, the Reeves. They're the only parents I remember. Why are you asking this now? Did you ever try to find out more about your birth parents?" "Blake, what is this about?" Her voice had taken on an edge. "Yes, I tried once when I was in college. All I learned was that my mother's name was Elizabeth. She died shortly after I was born, and my father had died before that, in some kind of accident. The records were sealed beyond that." Blake closed his eyes, his suspicions growing stronger. "Lily, I need you to trust me. I'm looking into something important, something that might connect us in ways we never imagined." "Connect us? Blake, we've known each other for a week." "I know how it sounds," he said, gripping the phone tighter. "But what if we've known each other much longer than that? What if we're—" He couldn't bring himself to say the word siblings, not yet, not without more proof. "What if we're what, Blake?" Her voice had grown quiet, wary. "Just meet me tomorrow," he said instead. "Please, I'll explain everything then." After they hung up, Blake returned to Jenkins' journal, reading deep into the night, absorbing the detective's increasingly desperate entries as he closed in on what he believed was a conspiracy of murder and financial fraud orchestrated by Edward Thorne, a conspiracy that had claimed the life of Jonathan Morrison, Blake's father. Around midnight, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Marina, Locker 247. Go now. Alone. RJ." Blake stared at the message, his exhaustion forgotten. Was he really being guided by the ghost of a detective who had disappeared 40 years ago? Or was someone elaborately manipulating him, using the past to lure him into some kind of trap? Either way, he knew he would go. The truth about his father, about Lily, about his own identity, it waited for him at the Sausalito Marina. With Jenkins' journal tucked inside his jacket, Blake headed for his car, unaware that he was being watched from across the street, where a black sedan idled in the shadows. In the darkness of that vehicle sat Victor Thorne, grandson of Edward Thorne and current CEO of Thorne Global. His cold eyes tracked Blake's departure as he spoke quietly into his phone. "He's taken the bait. Have our people at the marina ready. Tonight we finish what my grandfather started 40 years ago." As Blake drove across the Golden Gate Bridge towards Sausalito, the fog rolling in from the Pacific obscured the road ahead, a fitting metaphor for the uncertain path he now traveled. A path leading him inexorably toward a truth that would either unite him with a sister he never knew he had or destroy them both in the process. The Sausalito Marina was eerily quiet at 1 in the morning, sailboats gently rocking in their slips, rigging clanking softly in the breeze. Blake parked his car and made his way along the wooden docks, scanning the numbers on the storage lockers that lined the far wall. His footsteps echoed in the silence as fog curled around his ankles like ghostly fingers. Locker 247 was at the end of the row, its padlock rusted from decades of salt air. Blake stared at it, suddenly uncertain. If Jenkins' journal was authentic, this locker hadn't been opened since 1984. Any evidence inside would be nearly 40 years old. And yet, someone had sent him that text message tonight. Someone who knew about the locker, about Jenkins, about his father. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small tension wrench and pick, tools he'd acquired years ago during a phase when lockpicking had been a stress-relieving hobby. The skills came back to him easily, and within minutes the ancient padlock sprung open with a satisfying click. The metal door groaned as Blake pulled it open, releasing the musty scent of trapped air and old paper. Inside, a single cardboard box sat on a dusty shelf. Blake lifted it carefully, setting it on the ground before crouching to examine its contents. The box contained several manila folders, their edges yellowed with age. The first held newspaper clippings about Jonathan Morrison's disappearance and presumed drowning. The second contained financial documents, spreadsheets, bank statements, and a handwritten ledger detailing suspicious transactions at Avalon Investments. But it was the third folder that made Blake's blood run cold. Inside was a death certificate for Jonathan Morrison, dated not June 1982 but October 1983, 4 months after his supposed drowning. Attached to it was a police report describing how a badly decomposed body had washed ashore near Point Reyes, identified through dental records as Jonathan Morrison. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, but a handwritten note in the margin read, "Gunshot wound, back of skull." Deliberately misidentified by ME on Thorne's payroll. Next to the death certificate was a marriage license for Jonathan and Elizabeth Morrison, along with a birth certificate for their son, Blake Morrison, born February 14, 1983, and beside that a second birth certificate for Lillian Morrison, born October 1983. Mother, Elizabeth Morrison. Father, Jonathan Morrison. Blake stared at the document, his suspicions confirmed. Lily Reeves was indeed his sister. But if Jonathan Morrison hadn't died until October 1983, he had been alive when Blake was born. And if Lily had been born in October, that meant Elizabeth had been pregnant with her when Jonathan disappeared. The timeline wasn't making sense. Deeper in the box, Blake found a small leather journal, similar to Jenkins, but in different handwriting. The inscription on the first page read, "Property of Jonathan Morrison. If found, please return to Elizabeth at 1420 Pine Street." With trembling hands, Blake opened the journal. The entries began in January 1982 and detailed Jonathan's growing suspicions about his business partner, Edward Thorne. According to the journal, Jonathan had discovered that Thorne was laundering money for organized crime through their company, Avalon Investments. When confronted, Thorne had threatened not just Jonathan but his wife and unborn child. The final entry, dated June 15, 1982, read, "Thorne knows I've gathered evidence. Not safe anymore. Must protect Elizabeth and the baby. Detective Jenkins suggests staging my death and going into hiding until he can build a case against Thorne. God forgive me for what Elizabeth will suffer, believing I'm dead. But it's the only way to keep them alive. Jenkins will make sure they're taken care of financially." Blake sat back against the locker door, his mind reeling. His father hadn't drowned in a boating accident. He had faked his own death to protect his family from Thorne, leaving his pregnant wife behind. But something had gone wrong. According to the police report, Jonathan Morrison had been murdered in October 1983, the same month Lily was born and Elizabeth had died. A sudden noise made Blake look up. A figure stood at the end of the dock, silhouetted against the marina lights. For a moment, Blake thought it might be Ray Jenkins, but as the figure stepped closer, he could see it was a woman. "I wondered if you'd find your way here," Lily said, her voice carrying softly over the water. Blake rose to his feet, documents clutched in his hand. "Lily, how did you know you'd be here?" She moved closer, moonlight illuminating her face. "I received a package too, a journal, Detective Jenkins's journal." "But Jenkins gave me his journal," Blake protested. "He gave us each half," Lily explained. "Yours details the investigation into Avalon Investments. Mine chronicles what happened after, how Jenkins tried to protect Elizabeth Morrison and her newborn son after Jonathan's disappearance." Blake stared at her, trying to process this new information. "Did you read it all? Do you understand what it means?" Lily nodded slowly. "It means we're siblings, Blake. Half-siblings, actually." "Half?" Blake echoed, confusion evident in his voice. "According to Jenkins' journal, Elizabeth was already pregnant with me when she married Jonathan. My biological father was someone else, a man she'd been involved with before meeting Jonathan, but Jonathan loved her anyway, accepted me as his own." "Who was your real father?" Lily's expression hardened. "Edward Thorne." The revelation hit Blake like a physical blow. Thorne, but that would mean that the man who ordered Jonathan Morrison's murder was my biological father, yes. Her voice was steady, but Blake could see the pain in her eyes. Elizabeth left Thorne when she discovered what kind of man he really was. She was going to expose his crimes, so he arranged an accident for her, a car crash that she barely survived. That's when Jonathan found her, helped her escape, gave her a new identity as his wife. And Thorne never knew about you? Not until after I was born, Lily said quietly. Jenkins' journal says that Thorne somehow discovered the truth, that Elizabeth was alive and had given birth to his child. He wanted me, his heir. When Jonathan refused to tell him where we were hidden, Thorne had him killed. And your mother, Elizabeth? Lily's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Complications from childbirth, just as I was always told. Except it wasn't natural complications. According to Jenkins, Thorne found her in the hospital after I was born, and she couldn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Blake understood. Thorne had murdered Elizabeth, making it look like a natural death, but he hadn't found the baby. Lily had been safely hidden away, adopted by the Reeves family in Oregon, her identity concealed. And me? Blake asked. Where was I during all this? With your grandmother, Lily said. Jenkins arranged it all, made sure you were safe with her while he tried to build a case against Thorne. But then Jenkins disappeared in 1984, and the case went cold. Blake tried to make sense of it all, the tangled web of deception, murder, and hidden identities that had shaped both their lives without their knowledge. But then who is Ray Jenkins, the man who's been appearing in our lives, giving us these breadcrumbs to follow? Jenkins disappeared 40 years ago. Lily looked past Blake, toward the entrance to the marina. I think we're about to find out. Blake turned to see Ray Jenkins walking toward them, his weathered face solemn in the moonlight. But he wasn't alone. A younger man accompanied him, tall, distinguished, with the unmistakable features of Edward Thorne. Victor Thorne, Lily whispered. Edward's grandson. Blake instinctively moved in front of Lily, shielding her. What do they want? To finish what was started 40 years ago, she said, her voice barely audible above the lapping of water against the dock. Jenkins reached out to me 6 months ago, Blake. He's been in hiding all these years, gathering evidence against the Thornes. He needed our help to finally bring them to justice. My help? Why? Because you have access to financial records that could expose Thorne Global's continuing criminal activities. And because, Lily hesitated, then met his eyes directly. Because Victor Thorne is planning to acquire Morrison Enterprises through your upcoming merger. Blake felt as if the dock were tilting beneath his feet. The Peterson merger, the deal he'd been working on for 2 years, was with a subsidiary of Thorne Global. He'd had no idea. If the merger went through, Thorne would gain access to Morrison Enterprises' technology, client data, everything. It's a money laundering operation, Lily continued. Just like Avalon Investments was 40 years ago, they need your company's global reach and cutting-edge financial technology to expand their criminal enterprise. As Ray and Victor approached, Blake made a split-second decision. He shoved the documents back into the box and handed it to Lily. Get this to the FBI. Agent Sarah Daniels, she's an old friend. Her number is in my phone. He pressed his cell phone into Lily's hand. What about you? Fear flashed in her eyes. I'll keep them busy, Blake said, already turning to face the approaching men. Go, now. Lily hesitated only a moment before slipping into the shadows between the boat slips, the box clutched against her chest. Blake stepped forward, meeting Ray and Victor in the pool of light cast by a marina lamp. Victor Thorne's handsome face was marred by a cold smile that didn't reach his eyes that Blake now realized were remarkably similar to Lily's. Mr. Morrison, Victor said smoothly, we need to talk about your family history. I think I've learned enough for one night, Blake replied, keenly aware that he needed to buy time for Lily to escape. Ray Jenkins stood slightly behind Victor, his expression unreadable. Blake tried to catch his eye, to understand whose side The old detective was really on, but Jenkins' gaze remained fixed on the ground. "I doubt that," Victor chuckled. "For instance, did you know that your father stole millions from my grandfather before disappearing? Money that rightfully belongs to the Thorne family?" "That's not what the records show," Blake countered. "Your grandfather was laundering money for organized crime. My father discovered it and threatened to expose him." Victor's smile faded. "I see Jenkins' little treasure hunt has been informative. Unfortunately, those records won't hold up in court. They're 40 years old, possibly tampered with, certainly inadmissible." "Maybe," Blake conceded, "but the modern financial records, showing Thorne Global is still laundering money, those will be quite admissible." Something dangerous flashed in Victor's eyes. "What records?" "The ones I've been collecting for the past year," Blake bluffed, heart racing. "Did you really think I'd consider a merger without thoroughly investigating my potential partner? I know exactly what Thorne Global really is." Victor's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. "Then I'm afraid you've become a liability, just like your father was." Blake tensed, preparing for the worst, when Ray Jenkins suddenly stepped between them. "That's enough, Victor. You promised no violence." Victor's lip curled in contempt. "Step aside, old man. Your usefulness ended when you led Morrison to the locker." The realization hit Blake like a thunderbolt. Jenkins hadn't been helping them. He'd been working for the Thornes all along, leading Blake into a trap. But then, why had he given them the journals, the evidence? Victor pulled a gun from his pocket, aiming it first at Jenkins. 40 years late, but justice is finally served. Before Blake could react, the blast of the gunshot echoed across the marina. Jenkins crumpled to the dock, blood blossoming on his shirt. Victor turned the gun toward Blake. "Now about those records you claim to have..." Blake backed away, his mind racing. He had seconds to live unless he convinced Victor he was more valuable alive than dead. "Kill me, and the records go straight to the FBI. I have a dead man's switch set up." Victor hesitated, calculation evident in his cold eyes. "You're bluffing." "Am I? Why do you think I came alone? The evidence is already being delivered to the authorities as we speak." A flicker of doubt crossed Victor's face, but his finger tightened on the trigger nonetheless. "Then I'll have to work quickly to contain the damage." The second gunshot that night came not from Victor's weapon, but from behind Blake. Victor's eyes widened in shock as the gun fell from his suddenly limp fingers. He staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, where blood now stained his expensive suit. Blake turned to see Lily standing 20 feet away, a small pistol steady in her hands. Behind her, red and blue lights began to strobe across the marina as police cars pulled into the parking lot. "Jenkins called them before we came," she explained, lowering the gun. "He knew exactly what Victor would do. He sacrificed himself to give us time." Blake looked back at Ray Jenkins, who lay still on the dock, blood pooling beneath him. The old detective's eyes were open, fixed on the night sky, a strange peace in his expression. After 40 years in hiding, living with his failure to bring the Thornes to justice, to protect Jonathan Morrison and his family, he had finally completed his mission, at the cost of his life. As police officers swarmed the dock, Blake pulled Lily into his arms, holding his newfound sister tightly. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "It's finally over." But as Victor Thorne was handcuffed and led away, his eyes locked with Blake's one last time, and the hatred there made it clear. For the descendants of Jonathan Morrison and Edward Thorne, nothing was over. It had only just begun. The next 3 weeks unfolded in a whirlwind of police interviews, FBI investigations, and media frenzy. Blake and Lily found themselves at the center of what the press had dubbed the Thorne Conspiracy, a decade-spanning tale of murder, financial fraud, and family secrets that captivated the nation. Through it all, they clung to each other, the newly discovered sibling bond growing stronger with each passing day. Blake stood at the window of his penthouse, watching the rain trace patterns on the glass. It was the same view he'd looked out on countless times before, but everything felt different now. The emptiness that had haunted him for so long had been replaced by something more complex. Grief for the father he'd never truly known. Anger at the lies that had shaped his life. and a tentative sense of purpose that went beyond business success. The FBI confirmed it, Lily said, entering the living room with 2 mugs of tea. She'd been staying in Blake's guest room since the night at the marina. Neither of them wanted to be alone with Victor Thorne's associates, still at large. The financial records Jenkins collected proved decades of money laundering through Thorne. Global, they're executing search warrants at their offices as we speak. Blake accepted the mug, inhaling the fragrant steam. And Edward Thorne? Still being questioned. At 84, his lawyers are claiming he's too frail for extended interrogation, but Agent Daniels says they're making progress. Lily settled onto the sofa, tucking her feet beneath her. The old man hasn't seen his grandson since the arrest. Apparently, he's furious that Victor exposed the family to scrutiny. Family loyalty only goes so far, I guess, Blake observed, dryly. Speaking of which, the media is having a field day with our story. Lily grimaced. I've stopped reading the articles. Half of them paint us as tragic victims. The other half suggest we engineered the whole thing for publicity. And none of them know the whole truth. Blake joined her on the sofa, feeling the familiar ache that came whenever he thought about Ray Jenkins. The detective had been buried with honors the previous week, his decades in hiding finally over. His mission complete. DNA testing had confirmed his identity, putting to rest any doubts about the man who had orchestrated their discovery of the truth. I still can't believe Jenkins spent 40 years tracking the Thornes, Lily mused. Living under false identities, gathering evidence, waiting for the right moment. Waiting for us, Blake corrected. He needed someone with access to Thorne Global's modern financial operations, and he needed you, living proof of Edward Thorne's connection to Elizabeth. Lily stared into her tea. I've been thinking about her a lot. My mother, our mothers. The distinction was important. They shared a father in Jonathan Morrison, but Blake's biological mother had been the woman he'd grown up believing was killed with his father, while Lily's was Elizabeth Morrison, Jonathan's wife but Edward Thorne's former lover. Jenkins' journal said she was beautiful, kind. Blake had read both journals multiple times since that night, trying to piece together the fractured history of their family. He wrote that Jonathan loved her completely, even knowing you weren't biologically his. He was a good man. Lily's voice was soft with mourning for the father she'd never known. He could have abandoned her when he found out she was carrying another man's child, but instead he married her, planned to raise me as his own, and died protecting us both. Blake felt the weight of that sacrifice anew. According to Jenkins' journal, Jonathan had refused to reveal Lily's location, even under torture. His final act had been to ensure that Edward Thorne never found his biological daughter. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Blake tensed, automatically moving to shield Lily despite the security guard stationed in the hallway. Since Victor's arrest, they'd been taking no chances. Mr. Morrison, his assistant called through the door. Harrison Ward is here to see you. He says it's urgent. Blake exchanged a glance with Lily before moving to open the door. Harrison stood in the hallway, his normally impeccable appearance disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting sleepless nights. We need to talk, Harrison said, without preamble, brushing past Blake into the apartment. He stopped short when he saw Lily. Privately, anything you have to say to me, you can say in front of my sister, Blake replied firmly. Harrison's jaw tightened. Your sister. Right. The convenient, long-lost relative who appeared just in time to help you torpedo the biggest deal of your career and drag our company's name through the mud. Harrison, Blake began, but his friend cut him off. Do you have any idea what's happening at the office? The board is in panic mode. Clients are jumping ship, afraid of being associated with anything connected to Thorne Global. The stock has dropped 20% in 2 weeks. The stock will recover once the full story comes out, Blake said evenly. The FBI has publicly stated that Morrison Enterprises is a victim, not a co-conspirator. A victim, Harrison laughed, bitterly. Is that what you are now? The brave CEO who uncovered a criminal conspiracy? Because from where I'm standing, you look like a man who got played by a pretty face and an old detective's revenge fantasy. Lily rose from the sofa, her posture rigid. I think I'll give you two some privacy after all. No, stay. Blake caught her hand. squeezing it reassuringly before turning back to Harrison. "You're upset, and I understand why. The company's going through a difficult time, but everything I've done was to protect Morrison Enterprises from being used for money laundering." "Was it?" Harrison challenged. "Because it looks to me like you were so distracted by her that you lost focus on what matters. 2 years of work on the Peterson merger, down the drain. Millions in legal fees and PR damage control. For what? Some 40-year-old vendetta?" "For justice," Blake countered, feeling anger rise in his chest. "For the truth about my father, about what happened to him." "Your father died in a car accident when you were 12. Jaya, that was a lie." Blake's voice was ice. "My grandmother lied to protect me. My father was murdered by Edward Thorne for trying to expose his crimes. The same crimes Thorne Global is still committing today, the same crimes they would have used our company to facilitate if the merger had gone through." Harrison ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Even if that's true, and I'm not saying it is, what do you expect me to do with this information? The board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your future with the company. Some members are calling for your resignation." The news hit Blake like a physical blow, yet he found himself strangely unmoved by the prospect. The company had been his life for so long, his sole purpose, the thing that filled the emptiness inside him, or at least papered over it. Now, with Lily at his side and the truth about his past finally revealed, the prospect of losing it didn't terrify him the way it once would have. "Let them vote," he said quietly. "I'll accept whatever decision they make." Harrison stared at him in disbelief. "Just like that? You'd walk away from everything we've built?" "If necessary." Blake met his friend's gaze steadily. "There are more important things than stock prices and merger deals, Harrison. I thought you of all people would understand that." "What I understand is that you've changed," Harrison said, his anger giving way to something like concern. "Ever since you met her, you've been different, making choices that don't make sense, following ghosts and conspiracy theories instead of hard data." "I've changed because I've finally started to see clearly," Blake corrected him. "For years, I've been chasing success without purpose, accumulating wealth without meaning. I thought the emptiness I felt was just who I was, but now I know it was the absence of truth, of family, of connection." Harrison shook his head, moving toward the door. "I'll do what I can with the board, but I can't promise anything. They want stability, not some redemption story." After Harrison left, silence settled over the apartment. Lily studied Blake's face, searching for signs of regret or doubt. "Ah, you really prepared to lose your company over this?" she asked finally. Blake considered the question carefully. "I built Morrison Enterprises from nothing. It's been my life's work. But if the price of keeping it is burying the truth about our father, about what the Thornes did to our family, then yes, I'm prepared to lose it." Lily's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "You barely know me, Blake. We've only been in each other's lives for weeks. Why would you risk everything for this? For me?" "Because you're my sister," he said simply. "And because for the first time in my life, I'm doing something that matters beyond profit, margins and market share. I'm fighting for our father's legacy, his real legacy, not just the company I built with his name." His phone rang, interrupting the moment. The caller ID showed Agent Daniels from the FBI. "Morrison," he answered, putting the call on speaker for Lily to hear. "We have a situation," Daniels said without preamble. "Edward Thorne is offering a deal, full confession, all evidence of financial crimes going back decades, names of every co-conspirator, in exchange for immunity for himself and reduced charges for Victor." Blake and Lily exchanged alarmed glances. "That's not acceptable," Blake replied firmly. "It gets worse," Daniels continued. "He's threatening to release information that could be damaging to both of you if we don't accept his terms." "What kind of information?" Lily asked, her voice tight. "He claims to have evidence that you, Ms. Reeves, have known about your connection to the Thorne family for years, that you deliberately sought out Mr. Morrison as part of a long-term plan to gain control of his company." "That's absurd," Lily exclaimed. "I had no idea about any of this until Jenkins contacted me. He also claims that Mr. Morrison has been embezzling from his own company to fund a gambling addiction, and that the entire conspiracy theory about Jonathan Morrison's murder was fabricated to distract from impending financial improprieties that were about to be discovered during the merger due diligence. Blake felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. It's all lies, but he's smart. These accusations touch just close enough to reality to be believable. We did meet under unusual circumstances. The company is having financial issues now because of the merger collapse. He's twisting everything to create doubt. The Bureau doesn't necessarily believe these claims, Daniels assured them, but if Thorne goes public with them, it could complicate our case. The media would have a field day, and public sympathy might shift. So he's blackmailing the FBI, Blake summarized bitterly, using character assassination as leverage. Essentially, yes, we need your decision by morning. If you agree not to object to the deal publicly, we can probably get him to withhold the allegations against you. After Daniels hung up, Blake and Lily sat in stunned silence, the weight of the decision before them hanging heavy in the air. He's going to get away with it, Lily whispered finally, her voice breaking. After everything he did, to our father, to my mother, to Jenkins, he's going to walk free. Blake paced the length of the room, mind racing. Not necessarily. Thorne is offering this deal because the FBI must be closing in. He wouldn't be desperate otherwise. But if the FBI accepts his terms, then we'll have to find another way to expose him, Blake finished. The truth about what happened 40 years ago isn't just a legal matter. It's our history, our legacy. If the justice system can't or won't hold him accountable, then we'll take our case directly to the public. Lily looked skeptical. How? If he smears us in the media, who would believe us over one of the most powerful men in finance? Blake stopped pacing, a new resolve hardening within him. We have something Edward Thorne doesn't. We have our father's journal. We have Jenkins' records. We have the truth. And sometimes the truth is powerful enough to overcome even the most carefully constructed lies. And sometimes the truth gets buried by people with enough money and influence to bury it, Lily countered, rising to stand beside him. I'm not saying we shouldn't fight, Blake. I'm saying we need to be smart about how we fight. Blake looked at his sister, this woman who had been a stranger just weeks ago, but who now felt essential to his life, and saw in her eyes the same determination that had driven him to build his company from nothing. The same resolve that must have driven Jonathan Morrison to stand against Edward Thorne 40 years ago, even at the cost of his life. Then we'll be smart, he promised, but we will not be silent, and we will not let him win. Not again. Asbo. Night fell over San Francisco. Blake and Lily Morrison sat side by side, poring over their father's journals, searching for the one piece of evidence that might finally bring Edward Thorne to justice. Outside, rain began to fall again, washing the city clean as they prepared for the battle ahead. A battle not just for justice, but for the truth about who they were and who they could become together. In his high-rise office across town, Edward Thorne stood at a similar window, gazing out at the same rain-slicked city. His weathered hands clasped behind his back, his reflection ghostly in the glass. Behind him, a team of lawyers worked frantically to secure his freedom, to protect the empire he'd built on blood and lies. But in the privacy of his thoughts, a flicker of doubt had begun to take root. For in the faces of Blake and Lily Morrison, Edward Thorne had seen the unmistakable echo of the man he had ordered killed all those years ago, and in that resemblance lay the seed of his destruction, a reckoning delayed but never truly escaped, a justice that had patiently waited 40 years to be served. 6 months later, Blake stood at the podium in the newly renovated community center in San Francisco's Mission District. Sunlight streamed through the skylights, illuminating the faces of those gathered for the dedication ceremony, families from the neighborhood, city officials, journalists, and at the front, Lily, her pride evident in her warm smile. Today, we're not just opening a building, Blake began, his voice steady and confident in a way it had never been during corporate presentations. We're honoring a legacy. The Jonathan Morrison Community Center will provide educational resources, job training and support services to those who need it most in our city. It represents what my father truly stood for, not wealth or power, but justice and compassion. As he spoke, Blake glanced at the framed photograph displayed prominently in the entrance hall. a restored image of Jonathan Morrison smiling beside a pregnant Elizabeth. The picture had been among Jenkins' personal effects, preserved for decades as a reminder of what he was fighting for. Now it served as a daily inspiration to all who entered the center. The path to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. In the weeks following Edward Thorne's attempted deal with the FBI, Blake and Lily had faced the fight of their lives. The board of Morrison Enterprises had indeed voted to remove Blake as CEO, though they'd allowed him to retain his position as chairman, a compromise engineered by Harrison, who had eventually come to understand, if not fully embrace, Blake's transformation. Edward Thorne had carried through with his threats, leaking his fabricated stories to sympathetic media outlets. For a time, Blake and Lily had found themselves vilified in certain quarters, their motives questioned, their family history dissected by strangers with no knowledge of the truth. But they had refused to be silenced. Using the evidence from Jenkins and Jonathan's journals, supplemented by financial records Blake had secretly gathered during the merger negotiations, they had methodically built their case against the Thorne family. Not in the courts, where Edward's influence could still sway outcomes, but in the court of public opinion. Lily had written a book, part memoir, part investigative journalism, detailing the full story of Jonathan Morrison's murder and the subsequent cover-up. Blake had used his remaining influence in the business world to ensure the evidence reached key financial regulators who weren't susceptible to Thorne's pressure. Together, they had established the Morrison Truth Foundation, dedicated to supporting whistleblowers and investigative journalism targeting corporate crime. Their persistence had paid off. 3 months ago, faced with mounting evidence and eroding support even among his closest allies, Edward Thorne had suffered a massive stroke. From his hospital bed, perhaps sensing his mortality, he had finally confessed to orchestrating Jonathan Morrison's murder. Victor Thorne, abandoned by his grandfather and facing multiple federal charges without the promised protection, had followed suit, providing authorities with detailed information about Thorne Global's criminal operations in exchange for leniency. This center represents not just where we've been, but where we're going, Blake continued, looking out at the assembled crowd. It stands as proof that even the darkest secrets cannot remain hidden forever, that justice, though delayed, is not denied, and that the truth, however painful, sets us free in ways we never imagined possible. In the front row, Lily dabbed at her eyes, the emotion of the moment overwhelming her usual composure. Beside her sat Harrison Ward, whose initial skepticism had gradually given way to reluctant admiration for what Blake and Lily had accomplished. Their friendship, strained but not broken, was slowly healing as Harrison witnessed the positive impact of Blake's new direction in life. After the ceremony, as attendees mingled over refreshments, Blake found a quiet moment with Lily in the Dieter Center's small library, a room filled with books donated from her shop, which continued to thrive under her part-time management. "Dad would be proud," she said, linking her arm through his. "Of both of us." Blake nodded, still adjusting to the idea of Jonathan Morrison as Dad, a man he had never known but whose principles now guided his life. "I think he would. And I think Jenkins would be too." The old detective's sacrifice had not been in vain. The brass plaque beside the library entrance bore his name, honoring the man who had spent 4 decades working to bring truth to light. Outside the centers, Window's spring had come to San Francisco, cherry blossoms and magnolias painting the city in soft pinks and whites. New beginnings seemed to be everywhere, in the center, in the neighborhood it served, in Blake and Lily's evolving relationship, as siblings discovering one another after a lifetime apart. "Have you decided?" Lily asked, nodding toward the envelope in Blake's pocket, the formal offer from the board of Morrison Enterprises, asking him to return as CEO now that the company had weathered the worst of the storm. "I'm declining," Blake said, surprising even himself with how easy the decision felt. "The company's in good hands with Harrison. Besides, I have more important work to do now." That work had become increasingly clear over the past months. While the Morrison Truth Foundation provided a platform for exposing corporate wrongdoing, Blake had found deeper fulfillment in directly helping the people most affected by such crimes. The community center was just the beginning. Plans were already underway for similar centers in Oakland, Richmond, and other Bay Area communities where economic opportunity had long been scarce. "You've changed," Lily observed, not for the first time. "The Blake Morrison I first met would never have walked away from his company." "The Blake Morrison you first met was sleepwalking through his own life," he replied, "empty, alone, successful by every external measure and completely hollow inside. And now?" Blake smiled, gesturing to the room around them, to the children already discovering the books on the shelves, to the young adults signing up for coding classes, to the elderly neighbors who had found a welcoming space to share their wisdom with a new generation. "Now I understand what my father knew 40 years ago, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or stock options or corner offices. It's in the lives we touch, the truth we defend, the justice we fight for." Pretty profound for a former corporate shark, Lily teased, though her eyes shone with affection. "I had a good teacher," he said, squeezing her hand. "More than one, actually." As they moved to rejoin the gathering, Blake paused before the photograph of Jonathan and Elizabeth Morrison. In their faces, young, hopeful, unaware of the tragedy, that awaited them. He could see echoes of himself and Lily. The same determination in the set of Jonathan's jaw, the same compassionate intelligence in Elizabeth's eyes. For so long, Blake had defined himself by what he had built, by the empire that bore his name. Now he understood that his true inheritance had nothing to do with money or power. It was this, the capacity for courage in the face of wrongdoing, for love in the midst of loss, for hope when all seemed lost, the very qualities that had defined his father's brief but meaningful life. Outside, a spring rain began to fall, gentle and cleansing, much like the storm that had brought Blake and Lily together all those months ago. But this time there was no need to seek shelter. This time they stepped out into it willingly, faces upturned to the sky, embracing whatever came next, together. In his office across town, Harrison Ward sat at Blake's former desk, reviewing the quarterly reports with a new perspective. The rejection letter from Blake lay open before him, alongside a donation check to the Morrison Truth Foundation, a personal contribution from Harrison that represented his own transformation. On his wall hung a simple framed quote that Blake had given him before stepping down. "Success without purpose is the ultimate failure." And in a quiet cemetery on the city's edge, fresh flowers adorned 3 graves: Jonathan Morrison, Elizabeth Morrison, and Raymond Jenkins. The headstones gleamed in the soft rain, their inscriptions telling only the simplest version of a complex story: beloved father, loving mother, faithful friend. But the truth they had died protecting lived on in Blake and Lily Morrison, in the foundation that bore their name, and in the countless lives that would be changed, because 2 strangers had met in a storm and discovered they were family after all. The wheel had come full circle. What had begun 40 years ago with one man's stand against corruption had culminated in his children's triumph over the same enemy. What had been broken was mended. What had been hidden was revealed. What had been empty was now filled with purpose, with connection, with love. Blake Morrison, once defined by his possessions and achievements, had discovered the truth his father had known all along, that a life of substance is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you give away, not by the power you wield, but by the people you protect, not by the success you achieve, but by the values you uphold, even when they come at the highest cost. As he stood with his sister in the rain, watching the community gather in the center that carried their father's name, Blake felt the last of his old self wash away. In its place was something new yet ancient, something he had been searching for his entire life without knowing it, the sense of being exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do, with exactly the right people by his side. "Ready?" Lily asked, taking his arm as they prepared to return to their guests. Blake smiled, feeling the raindrops cool against his skin, hearing the distant echo of lives intersecting, past, present, and future, bound together in ways too complex, to fully comprehend, but too powerful to deny. "I've never been more ready in my life," he said, and together they walked back into the light.